So the best advice I can give you is when you first get there, you got to beat somebody up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's... And then
Wait. That's the prison advice. This is episode 99.
Yeah, we got to think about what we want to do for 100. It's just an arbitrary number anyway.
That's right. It's not like it's base 2 power or anything. We get to 128. That's the party right there.
Your mom's a base 2.
All right, here we go. Today is Monday, December 29th, 2014, and this is episode 99 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Mr. Bell. How are you, sir?
I'm pretty good. Hope you are too.
I'm doing all right.
All right, so we're creeping up on that major milestone of 100, which I'm sure will have some gigantic bash. I have no idea what we'll do yet. Probably be a normal episode, but anyhow, we do have some listener mail that I wanted to cover tonight. So the first one we have comes from Philip. He actually is asking a question about risk management and communicating risk to executives. So in particular, I guess he ran into a situation where he was at a store, a neighborhood grocery store, and the POS terminal they had was kind of leaking information about what operating system it was using and things like that. And apparently Philip tried to talk to the manager and let them know, maybe you want to be a little more on the down low about what's running on your POS terminals there. And the ultimate question is, how do you communicate those kinds of maybe nuanced concerns to non-technical executives? And so this kind of rolls up into the bigger risk management discussions with management and executives. And, I think from my standpoint, we've talked about this in the past, the most important thing is being able to communicate in business terms. So, not trying to convey it in terms of the technology problem, but what is the impact to the business? For instance, you'll lose customers, you'll lose sales, those sorts of things. If you can, obviously this is kind of an edge case, I suppose, but in general, if you can quantify the concern you have into dollars, cents, widgets sold, widgets lost, that sort of thing, that helps facilitate the discussion, in my view. I don't know if you had a different idea.
Yeah, I think taking just one step back, part of the challenge here is when you're especially approaching someone like this is they aren't necessarily in a frame of mind to hear what you have to say, regardless of how you present it. Random manager dude at a store got 1,000 problems, and you come to him with some weird nerd thing, and it may not even resonate. It may just bounce right off him, no matter how you present it. So,
True.
I think part of the challenge is approaching someone who may care, right? And maybe that's a timing thing. Maybe that's an approach. Maybe that's an individual. But, part of the challenge is you've got to find somebody who would at least listen. And the situation here, if you take a step back and look at it from a societal standpoint, you as a customer, although you have that customer and they have the management relationship, you have no relationship or authority or respective position in an IT role. So it's difficult to have that conversation when you are not in any sort of position of respect around that particular topic. If you came up to them and said, "Hey, you've got some spoiled produce on aisle 7," they'll hear that from you because that's the expected role that you're playing in that relationship. When you come up to them and say, "Hey, you got some bad shingles on your roof," they're going to look at you like, who are you and why are you telling me this? So I think that can apply in a bigger picture too of a role in in corporate America. And not that it's a good thing to do, but I think a lot of people filter based on expectations. So if I'm a CISO and I've got a secretary talking to me about a random IT security thing, that if I've got a little bit of arrogance, or I'm busy, or I'm not open to that, I may very quickly brush that by, as opposed to somebody who's on my InfoSec team. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling here, but
no, I think you're right on, and you hit on an important point, that this is, especially communicating in this kind of circumstance, and even more broadly, like you just described, there's a lot of psychology here. It's not necessarily a simple matter of an information security problem. This is, this is a social science kind of, or social psychology kind of a problem. Another piece of advice I'd throw out is to make it about the person, and it is helping them out rather than trying to avoid loss of their customers, right? So, this kind of goes a little bit in starting to stray into to the area of social engineering, right? And how do you get people to trust you and pay attention to you and those sorts of things. And one of the, I think you brought up a really good point, that people have an expectation about what your role is, and I think that's certainly true. In my view, you can help mitigate that a little bit by, again, making it about their person, about that particular person. You might lose some money if you don't, because of this particular problem. Not you're going to piss off a bunch of customers, or you're going to lose customer data. You basically want to be seen as trying to help that person. Hey, you dropped $20, or hey, you're trying to make it about them. That's that'd be my bit of advice.
Yeah, the other thing that I think it's good, and the other thing that occurred to me that also why it may be difficult in this particular example is maybe this is something this person has no control over. And, this is all set at corporate, and corporate decides all that, and that's not my thing, and I got enough to worry about. Go talk to corporate. Kind of mindset. Which is not necessarily a good thing. Or
it's outsourced. I mean, we've talked about a lot of, I don't know how it is where Philip lives, but here in the States at least, this is it's not uncommon, especially for the smaller companies, to have outsourced that stuff. So, there's somebody else owns and manages those systems. They just, their employees just use them. So, you don't know. It's a good point. So the next bit of mail we have comes from Chris, and Chris is asking about steganography, and if we, either you or I, have ever seen steganography or steganographic techniques used in a breach situation, basically to aid exfiltration. And I would say the only one that I'm aware of, and whether or not you consider it steganography is tenuous, right? But exfiltrating data through DNS, I've seen that. But
yeah, is that technically steganography?
No, not really.
Yeah,
it's really just a covert channel. But yeah. as far as credit card numbers being encoded in in porn pictures, no, I've never seen that.
Yeah, it's a clever technique. I've never really, that I can think of off the top of my head, seen it in an active situation. I think part of it is because data's gotten too big to really effectively hide well in pictures or audio files and that kind of stuff. I don't know. It's one of those fun things to play with, and it's a neat proof of concept, but I've very rarely encountered it in the wild.
Yeah, and I did a little bit. I mean, I didn't do a ton, but certainly went back through all of the things I've read, and I can't remember having ever read of any circumstances where steganography was used in a breach. But you know what? Hey, one of the issues is I think it's probably a more advanced technique that you would see being used again by more advanced attackers who are probably a lot less likely to be caught, and therefore maybe it happens all the time and
Right.
we don't know about it.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Maybe it's just so good they just don't get caught.
Right.
So,
Hard to say. But, it's I would say that as it's steganography is probably one of those areas where as organizations become more mature in their ability to detect data leaving out the door, that's quite possibly one of the new horizons for the bad guys.
the other thing I'd say is there's so many other ways to get data out. Why go to all the trouble of steganography?
Well, that's a good point, and it's also a pretty low bandwidth option, and like you said, it'd be really difficult to encode 100 terabytes of Sony data steganographically.
It's sexy and fun, but why go harder than you need to go?
Well, exactly. And then the last email we got comes from a listener in Germany, and Chris followed up from our last episode where we talked about the report from the German, I think it was BSI, the German Data Protection Agency, and the report was actually written in German, and Chris actually did us the kind favor of translating the portion that relates to this attack on the steel plant. And what was really interesting to me, what struck me, is that there was a whole bunch of hoopla made, a whole lot of news articles written about this. And when you actually read what is in the report, there's not much. It's pretty sparse. So, I'll just kind of read it verbatim. So, situation: targeted attack on a steel plant in Germany. Method: via spearphishing and sophisticated social engineering, attackers initially obtained access to the office network of the steel plant. From there, they successively worked their way into the production networks. Damage effect: outages of individual control components or entire systems became increasingly frequent. The outages had as an effect that a blast furnace could not be shut down in a controlled manner and was left in an undefined state. The consequence was massive damage to the system or plant. And then, let's see, technical skill level. The technical skills of the attackers had to be qualified as very advanced. A multitude of different internal systems were compromised, up to and including industrial components. The technical knowledge of the attackers was considerable not only in the field of classical IT security, but it also extended to detailed, specialized knowledge about industrial control systems and production processes that were in use. If you take it as gospel, right, it does sound like they actually got into the industrial control systems themselves, which is non-trivial. But again, there's not enough detail to really say much. So we still don't know, exactly what they did. What was the actual attack? Did they intentionally modify the logic in the industrial controller, or did they just trip over something and screw it up?
Like inadvertent DOS, right?
Right.
They just messed up the machine that controls it, and as a result, they couldn't control it, and bad things happened.
Yeah. So
we appreciate the translation, though. That's definitely very handy.
It was awesome. So, thank you much, and as always, if you have any thoughts or questions, send us an email. We do read them. So, getting into our stories for this week, the first one, obviously we have to start with Sony, because hey, everything's about Sony right now. And this first story comes from the Security Ledger, and the title is "New Clues in Sony Hack Point to Insiders Away from DPRK." And this is kind of a rehash, I suppose, of a report. I don't know if it's really a report, but a press release, at least, by Norse, whose researchers did some analysis of data that was stolen as part of this breach, which included some data about terminations. So apparently there was a layoff back in the first quarter or early second quarter of 2014. And they looked through the roster of who was laid off and found apparently an unnamed woman who they describe as having the means and motive for pulling off this kind of an attack. And they apparently chased her around on the internet a little bit, looking at where she was hanging out, and they I guess have identified, I think, 5 other people, including other than her. I don't think these other 5 people were tied to Sony, and they don't actually say how they came to suspect these other 5 people, but they did mention that there was some conversations between these other 5 people and this unnamed woman about a server which was an apparent source of some of the malware that was seen. So, it's kind of a weird thing. They do go on to say that they're not claiming this is really credible information, which is interesting because it's at the same time is very, very specific. They're kind of saying, we think it was this lady with these 5 other people who were effectively getting retribution on the company for this layoff. And by the way, these other people are probably mad at Sony because we think they're aligned with the Pirate Bay or something like that. So they have motivation as well. And who knows? So apparently they have handed over their information to the FBI today, and it will be interesting. Now, I will tell you, this obviously everybody and their dog is talking about this Sony story right now, and a lot of people are really becoming convinced that it's not North Korea that did that, and I think that's probably a fair assessment. Although I will tell you, if I were North Korea, I wouldn't want people really to be able to tie it back to me either. But I will say that I'm really skeptical about some of the comments they make in this report, like, that it would require an insider to be able to have the level of knowledge about the internal networks and where the important servers are and the credentials in order to pull this thing off.
Not true.
Exactly. So I have a hard time reconciling in my mind how a company like Norse would make an assertion like that.
Yeah, so backing up just a tad in the story too, a lot of this is incredibly circumstantial and coincidental, what their findings are. Clearly, Norse is kind of in a bit of a startup phase. They're a threat intelligence vendor. Certainly they want to get their name out there and release some information. However, that being said, I have never been in the North Korea camp. And I've been very vocal about that, and to the point where I have now bought into that theory so much that clearly I can never change my mind regardless of facts. But that being said, I still feel something that started this early on, long before the interview came into the picture, which I really do think is a red herring, was much more personal, and some sort of blackmail or extortion was going on. If you look at the very first communication on the blacked out desktops, it was about demands that we have made for Sony management. And we have never heard what those demands were. So the concept of an insider being involved somewhat fits that narrative to me, especially when you look at the volumes of data that were taken out. External hard drive is a much more viable mechanism for doing that. Now, that being said, I don't put any more stock in the Norse stuff than I do anybody else's. just by the fact that they're Norse, or it better fits my version of reality, whatever. It's interesting. I guess what I'm saying is that it somewhat backs up my gut feeling. I shouldn't say backs it up. It somewhat flows with my gut feeling of what truly motivated this attack. But I don't know if they're right. But I just don't. I still don't buy the North Korea over the interview. I think that is the mainstream media jumping all over this, the feds and everybody else getting involved, and not looking at the initial communications, the initial facts. The interviews had nothing to do with it until days and days and days later, and they said, "Oh, and in addition to everything else, don't show the interview."
You know, I gotta say, if it pans out not to be North Korea, you know, if it is this what do they call her, Leanna, or they gave her a code name, but if it does turn out to be that person and no way associated with North Korea, all I got to say is, holy crap, what a mess the U.S. made, the U.S. government made.
And which is why I don't think the U.S. government will ever admit otherwise.
Well, that's a good point. That's a good point. Now, I guess there's a couple of other things that I'll bring up. You know, I think one of the initial things I read about was somebody did an analysis of the file dates, the time and dates of the files that were dumped, and they looked basically at the size and the date, and they basically figured out that it was roughly the speed of USB 2. Interesting.
I had not seen that report.
Yeah, actually, I think it's referenced very briefly in here, and I think that was one of the early Norse findings. But you know, there's another explanation for that, in that, you know, they may have had that on a local. They may have already copied all that data to a local system, and they made their own, you know, separate copy onto another device before uploading it. So, you know, that's not necessarily a home run. You know, attribution element. So, you know, we just have to be kind of careful. The other thing we don't know is how long it took them, right? So and it's said somewhere in here, you know, that they're kind of implying that all this happened in a very compressed time frame. But I've not really heard anything that describes how long the actual attack took place. You know, we know that the malware that did the wiping was compiled, you know, a day or two before the actual attack happened, or before the systems were wiped. But we don't know, you know, over what time horizon was the data exfiltrated. There are some indicators, I would say, that, for instance, we know some of the email archives that were dumped contained email from the GOP people themselves. So obviously it was, you know, some of it was at least relatively current, but we don't know. I haven't really heard that. It would certainly, I think, give the whole insider with a USB drive a lot more credibility if all that data were, you know, copied off within a day or two before the attack. But I haven't heard.
Yeah, it's so tough to say. You know, and this is the challenge we have here. And somebody put this on Twitter, and I really apologize for not being able to find it, because I hate to take credit for somebody else's observation, and my apologies. But somebody said, you know, the trouble with attribution and the trouble with these sorts of meta info is that the attacker controls all of it.
Exactly.
Right? So how can you trust it?
Exactly. And I've long had a hard time with people really putting stock in compile dates on malware, or, you know, languages for, you know, the language that a computer is set up to use, which was used to compile the malware. All that stuff is ephemeral. It's trivial to change. And in fact, if I were a bad person and I wanted to, you know, I wanted to obscure my tracks, those are some of the things that I would first think about changing. So, you know, it's a little frustrating to me that we collectively as an industry seem so apt to trust those things. So, especially since we're otherwise such a skeptical bunch, and then we don't have any problem just blindly accepting a compile date.
Yep.
But anyhow, moving on to the next story, which is also related to Sony. This one comes from Data Breach Today, and the title is 6 Breach Lessons We Must Learn. I'm sorry, 6 Sony breach lessons we must learn. And number 1 is watch your risk tolerance. And they point out that some of the emails that were leaked, when you read some of them, especially those from the CISO, there's this error that the business was accepting a lot of risk. And I think their point is that they were probably accepting more risk than they really understood. And that's something that I've talked about a lot too. And I've written a couple of things about this. I really honestly think that businesses accept risk that they don't really understand. They don't have their head around what the actual impact of the thing they're accepting is. So, number 2, this is vandalism, not war. I think that's a pretty cogent, sane statement. Number 3, although I don't necessarily think that's a lesson as much as a statement. Number 3, data exfiltration must be caught. I.e., how can it be that hundreds, tens or hundreds of terabytes of data were exfiltrated without being detected?
Wow.
And by the way, that goes even for a USB drive, right?
Data wants to be free, my friend.
That's true. That's very true. Number 4, we're all vulnerable. So, we need to be... Oh, go ahead.
I just want to jump onto that because a lot of people say, yeah, I may be vulnerable, but who would come after me anyway? So I would say we're all vulnerable and we're all targets.
Yeah, potential targets.
Yeah. There's a lot of people who believe, well, I've got nothing worth hacking anyway. And I think that's a faulty belief.
Right, because, there's multiple, there's lots of different economic, not in the financial sense, but the reasons that people might go after you are varied. And so if it does turn out that Norris is right, it wasn't an economic incentive that Sony was targeted. It was, and they had an axe to grind. And now they want that company dead.
Yep.
So that's, you have to be cognizant that just because you don't have, super secret stealth fighter plans, that you could still be, you're a grocery chain and you could have fired the wrong person and now they're going to be hell bent on taking you down. So be aware. And hey, there you go. Number 5, be aware of the business impact. So I think that kind of goes back with number 4 a little bit, but again, understanding what is the total impact that you have to lose, right? Because their point is when Sony compiles all of the costs associated with this thing, it's going to be outrageous. And they make the point that it's not clear if Sony were an independent, if Sony Pictures Entertainment, which is the entity that was targeted, it wasn't the bigger Sony. If they were not if they were not part of the bigger Sony umbrella, would they or would they not be able to survive? And that's not a question we can answer, but it's it's something to think about. And number 6, these incidents make us all look bad. And I think that's probably more true, especially with this particular case, probably more than anything else I can ever remember. It is all over the news. I mean, it's on every single news channel. I guess it's subsiding a little bit right now. But because Sony is an entertainment company, there's this really big clash or crossover between information security and pop culture news. And I really think this is not doing our industry a great service. I also think that depending on what happens over the next couple of months and what finally shakes out as the root cause of this thing, I forecast that we're going to see another Edward Snowden-like witch hunt in boardrooms across the world. Where with Edward Snowden, the boards of director all over the world went on a witch hunt. Trying to figure out how do we keep our confidential data out of the hands of those dirty contractors. And it was a red herring,
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a fundamental assumption that contractors are inherently more likely to be malicious insiders than employees, and I'm not sure that's true.
Well, exactly right. We collectively spent all of this effort chasing after, kind of a non-issue, or really not the right issue, I should say.
Yeah.
And I fear that we're going to see that in the wake of Sony too.
I guess it depends. I guess it depends on what the narrative is. And this is the interesting part of the narrative being it was North Korea. That takes a lot of people off the hook. Because what are you going to do? The assumption is that if it's a nation state, it's nigh impossible to defend yourself, and you just run that risk if you're out in the big bad world. I don't know that narrative will change, but if the narrative is it was a malicious insider and a bunch of malicious hackers, that changes the fundamentals of responsibility. And rightly or wrongly, the assumption is, well, you should be able to defend yourself against non-nation state hackers.
Absolutely. I think it goes. I think the conversation turns from oh, poor Sony, there was nothing you could have possibly done, to Sony, you shot yourself in the foot. You hired a bad person. You have bad security. You should have seen this coming. What did you do? Look at the mess you made. And I really think that's how that conversation will change. Yeah. If in fact that's how the dynamic changes. So we shall see. So our next story, moving away from...
One other thing I'll say is, let's look back to the fact, too, that we still don't know what the initial attack was, the initial vector and the initial exploits. We have no idea on Sony.
Or if there were any.
Well, there had to have been at some point just to get the dropper out, or the wiper out there. Well, and to gather all the information. Are you implying that the initial gathering all that information was by somebody with appropriate privilege?
It certainly seems, again, assuming that the Norse idea is accurate, just for the sake of argument.
Sure.
I don't think you would find much in the way of an initial attack vector.
Okay.
Most likely they didn't terminate her account, and she still had access. And that nobody ever changes admin passwords because that's really hard and painful, and who wants to do that? So, if in fact that's what happened, versus an external party coming in, which is probably still relatively easy to do with a phishing email or whatever. I bet you, it was pretty simple.
Indeed.
Because the thing, the wiper was itself a worm, right? So all they needed to do was launch that sucker on one computer, and it was off to the races.
True.
So, anyhow, moving on to our next story, which comes from the Register. The title is ISC.org website hacked. Scan your PC for malware if you stop by. So ISC is not the Internet Storm Center. It is the Internet Software Consortium. I think that's what it stands for. Internet Systems Consortium. and they are the group that makes Bind and the ISC DHCP server, and among other things, I think. And their website had been hacked and was serving up an exploit kit.
Awesome.
Yeah, and so the initial concern, I remember when this happened, the initial concern was, oh my God, DHCP, the DHCPD and Bind were, holy cow, were those modified and now rogue copies are roaming the internet. And in fact, apparently that is not what happened. ISC.org apparently runs WordPress with maybe some dodgy plugins. And I'm going to guess, based on what's described here, it sounds like that recent Slider vulnerability where there was a worm running around compromising WordPress sites that had that plugin installed, and so it's and in fact I think their chief security officer, ISC security officer, said that it's not clear that they were actually targeted. It looks more like they were just exploited by a bot or something. So, but again, I think this goes back to the point that ISC.org is something that your sysadmins are probably visiting, and now you have here is an example where they're visiting a legitimate site and it's serving up an exploit kit, and if they're running with admin rights, domain admin privileges, you potentially have a really big problem. I don't specifically know, and I don't think they know either, what the malware that got pushed down did. But here's an example of another case where these drive-bys are becoming a lot more problematic. And I'm not going to say these were targeted, but you can imagine a situation where this would be a great way to target a certain demographic. So, anyhow, moving on to our next story. It comes from Dark Reading, and the title is "Attackers Leverage IT Tools as Cover." This is a really pretty good article for everybody to read, and they interview a couple of different companies. And I think it was NeoHapsis, I believe, was one of the primary groups they interview. And basically they're talking about how they are forecasting more and more attacks to leverage, I guess for lack of a better word, off-the-shelf administrative and security tools as part of the attack chain. And so we've seen that for a long time, or at least I've seen it for a long time, where the bad guys were using things like PSExec and RDP. But they're pointing out that, hey, it's not inconceivable that we would see attackers using antivirus to look for credit card numbers in memory, or to use your IDS system to build a map of your network, and so on and so on, and using your patch management system to provision malware, which, by the way, is best I understand, is what happened in the South Korea attack from last year. So,
and there was talk of a software distribution server being used to target.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yep.
I don't know that we ever got that confirmed. Let me be careful there, but I remember there was a rumor going on that there was a software distribution server used to push the malware out to all the POS boxes.
Right. So I think this is a good thing to read, in that we generally are building up a pretty significant infrastructure of tools to help protect our environment, but we have to be cognizant that those tools can be used against us if they're not properly protected. And so anyway, give that a read and think about how that might apply in your specific environment. I think we'll be talking about this some more. Certainly, I've seen this sort of thing manifest itself in some breaches. So it's not, I think this isn't a future forward-looking statement. Some of it, I think, is a little fanciful, like antivirus looking for credit card numbers. But hey, anything's possible.
Well, it seems like DLP would be a better fit for that, but
well, I don't think DLP usually looks in memory, so I think that's probably why.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I suspect that's why they're.
I was just thinking on the line for whatever reason, but you're right.
And then the last story we have tonight comes from back at the Register, and the title is J.P. Morgan Chase Mega Hack. Love that. I wish they would have called it a mega cyber hack. Then it would have been even better. Was a simple two-factor auth fail, and this stupid story, and I say that with all due respect to everybody who was involved in the reporting of this story. And we all know what all due respect means, right?
Right.
But anyway, it's a really odd story. They're basically saying, "Oh, we had this huge hack," and at the core of it was we just forgot this server. We just, we had been going through our environment and rolling out two-factor authentication, and we just forgot that server. And what do you know? That's the server that got hacked, and bing, bang, boom. Oops. It was, it was just a mistake. We just forgot to install two-factor. But I call shenanigans.
Well, let's first back up for a moment and say that this narrative is a common narrative that we hear. Bad inventory control. We forgot about a server. We forgot about this. We forgot about that. So, regardless of what happened to JP Morgan, I think there's a lesson to be learned in that this is a common narrative of know what's on your damn servers and systems and networks, folks.
Oh, absolutely.
And, confirm it. Anyway, but back to your shenanigans.
No, so I think you are absolutely right. I do not deny that I have to assume that the reporting is correct. They probably did have a server where they forgot to install two-factor authentication. However, not installing two-factor authentication does not make a server vulnerable to hacking, right?
Correct.
There were other things going on here, a lot of which were already reported on, by the way. And so what I find it really curious that it's like, we're just going to let the air out of the balloon. Oh, yeah, it was just this two-factor thing. We just forgot to install it. That's what happened. Oops, sorry. Move along. I think you hit on a very important point. What happened here is extraordinarily common, right? And I've been having some discussions with other people about the importance of inventory, and one of the central tenets of how IT security is modeled today, for right or for wrong, is predicated on not having willy-nilly crap on your network, right? You gotta have control, because there are complicated trust relationships between different systems in your environment. And if a particular system is vulnerable or weaker than another part, it's the whole weakest link, kind of concept. Pretty basic, but that's why I think until things radically change, inventory is really important. You've got to know what's out there. It's got to be maintained, because the interplay between systems is often very complicated and not well understood by most IT and IS groups in particular. But anyway, I actually did a bit of a retrospective write-up on how I think J.P. Morgan is getting off a little bit easy, because it wasn't just this two-factor authentication problem, right? We know from a pretty long timeline of successive reports, that first we know that apparently the initial point of intrusion was through a vulnerable web application, right? So then we know that 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 system, or I think there were a total of 90 systems that were ultimately compromised, were being controlled by a command. Were beaconing into a command and control system, which they only found upon investigating the compromise of a totally unrelated system, their corporate challenge website. Right? They found that system had been compromised. They looked at the traffic, and I'm doing a little bit of inference here, right? But they looked at the traffic beaconing out from that corporate challenge website, and they looked in other parts of their environment, and they found, oh, look, we got these 90 systems that are being controlled by that same command and control system. And that's how they found it out. So there's another problem. There were gigabytes, kind of like in the Sony case, right? Maybe not as much, right? But there were literally gigabytes and gigabytes of data. About 80 million households in the U.S. were stolen and not detected. And so I say to blame this all on a missing two-factor authentication is really, giving a disservice to this. And the reason I bring this up is that in every breach that I've ever been involved in or seen or read about, it isn't one thing. It's never missing two-factor authentication. It's a chain of things that happen. Either they're intentional or they're accidental. But, there's always a long train of errors or problems that result in these really big breaches. And I think we often miss that context.
It's almost like a chain, perhaps like a kill chain.
Well,
no, you hit on a good point, and honestly, that is exactly the same way people talk about aviation disasters and aviation accidents. Is the exact same context. There is a series of events that lead to an aviation issue, and if any of those can be stopped or solved or avoided, the entire situation would have been avoided. So it's interesting, the parallels there. But yeah, I concur, Doctor. That's all I can say.
Here in the U.S., there was a TV series called Modern Marvels, which I'm not sure if it's still on or not. But they had for a period of time, they had a kind of a segment of dedicated shows that they called Engineering Disasters. And it occurred to me, and I watched those probably 10 or more years ago, but kind of reflecting on it now, all of those engineering disasters, whether they're bridge collapses or buildings falling over or what have you, they all have that same problem. Man-made disasters tend to always have this kind of a chaining type problem where there's lots of opportunity for it to go right, but we tend to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, and I think we need to, as defenders, we need to figure out how to better leverage that. So that's I guess that's where I wanted to drive that point to. And by the way, I don't bring this up to berate J.P. Morgan, right? I'm more berating the reporting of this. I can't really say J.P. Morgan had an unusual problem here. That they seem to be somewhat upfront and open about what was happening. I think there was some criticism about maybe how they handled the data that was stolen and whatnot. But from an IT security perspective, I don't think they were really out of line. I'm not throwing rocks at them for that. I'm just throwing rocks at the reporting. So there you go.
Fair enough.
And that is the last show of 2014.
Hey, before we wrap up, I do want to make mention of a bit of a somber topic, if you're okay with that.
Have at it.
So, some of our listeners probably know this, some may not. That somebody who was very, very active in the information security community was killed yesterday. Very good friend of mine, Michael Hamlin, was killed in an automobile accident in Texas, visiting family. He lives here in Georgia. His wife was with him in the vehicle. She sustained some injury, but nothing life-threatening. She'll be fine. Michael had been kicking around the information security community for a long time. He worked at Security and Vigilar and maybe not Vigilar, sorry, but a lot of early information security community companies here in Atlanta. Worked for IBM recently as part of the X-Force team and just recently took his first CISO role. So brilliant, talented, amazing guy. Very good friend, will be deeply missed. So just wanted to make mention of that.
Yeah, I know you and he were good friends, and I certainly extend my condolences to you. And I think I only had met him once or twice through you. And actually, I think the last time was last New Year's when we were in your hot tub. So,
well. Yes, good
there
times.
You go. That's right.
Yeah, a lot of good memories. But honestly, I'm more thinking about his wife and his family than me at the moment. But thank you.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I'm not my usual cheery self on the show today. I apologize for that.
No, understand, and again, sorry for your loss, and sorry for everybody who knew him. And based on what I saw on Twitter today, he was very well liked and known by many. So,
yeah, he's been around. He was part of Conshoto, the original group that did the Capture the Flag competition at DEF CON. I mean, I can't do it justice, but he's definitely been a contributor to the information security community for a long time.
Yep. All right. Well. Hopefully next week we'll have a happier note. But in any event, if you have any thoughts or opinions or questions, send us an email to info@defensivesecurity.org. You can find the website and show notes and all of our previous episodes and whatnot on our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can follow the podcast on Twitter @DefensiveSec. You can follow Mr. Callett on Twitter @Lurg, and you can follow me on Twitter @MaliciousLink. And with that, we will talk again next week with our grand episode 100 spectacular.
Take care, everybody. Have a good week.
Take care. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Bye.